The residence at 324 Cameron Road in Medicine Hat, Alberta, stood as a monument to suburban stability. Inside, Mark and Deborah Richardson curated a life defined by traditional values and protective oversight, unaware that the safety of their idyllic home was an illusion. Their 12-year-old daughter, Jasmine, had violently detached from the family unit, spiraling into a goth subculture and the arms of 23-year-old Jeremy Steinke. To the Richardsons, Steinke was a predator. To Steinke, he was a romantic martyr in a dark fantasy, fueling a lethal obsession that viewed the parents as the sole obstacle to their union. The collision of these worlds on April 23, 2006, resulted in a brutality that shattered the community. Yet, the true unraveling of Jeremy Steinke would not occur in the shadows of the crime scene, but under the fluorescent lights of the courtroom. It was there that his narrative of a devoted protector crumbled, exposed by the cold, calculated evidence provided by the very girl he killed for. This is the story of a rebellion-turned-massacre, and the revelations that dismantled a killer. Before we continue with this disturbing case, please subscribe to our channel if you haven't already, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support is what allows us to continue bringing these important stories to light. The story begins not with blood, but with the quiet, suffocating normalcy of Medicine Hat, Alberta. Known as the Gas City for its vast natural gas reserves, it sits in the deep southeast of the province, a community of 60,000 defined by its prairies, its coulees, and a conservative, family-oriented rhythm that suggests safety. In 2006, the Richardson family was the archetype of this stability. They lived in a pale grey bungalow on a quiet street, a structure that projected the modest, hard-working values of the people inside. Mark Richardson was 42 years old, a dedicated husband, and a man known for his gentle demeanour and reliability. His wife, 48-year-old Deborah, was equally committed to the domestic sphere, a mother whose world revolved around the cultivation of her children's futures. They were not people who courted danger. They were people who followed the rules, attended to their duties, and expected the same from the world around them. At the center of their concern was their 12-year-old daughter, Jasmine. To the outside observer, Jasmine was a child navigating the turbulent waters of early adolescence, but within the walls of the Richardson home, a tectonic shift was occurring. Photographs from her earlier childhood show a girl with bright eyes and a soft smile, the picture of innocence. However, by the spring of 2006, that image had been aggressively dismantled. Jasmine had begun to retreat behind a veil of black eyeliner and dark clothing, adopting the aesthetic of the goth subculture. While such stylistic rebellions are common rites of passage, the transformation in Jasmine was accompanied by a hardening of her personality, a detachment that unnerved her parents. The Richardsons, grounding their parenting in traditional values, viewed this metamorphosis with growing alarm, unaware that their daughter was not merely acting out, but was actively seeking a catalyst for a much darker evolution. That catalyst existed just a few miles away, inhabiting a reality that felt light years removed from the Richardsons' tidy bungalow. Jeremy Steinke was 23 years old, a high school dropout drifting through a life marked by instability and a meticulously crafted delusional persona. Steinke did not view himself as a mere unemployed young man living in a trailer park. He presented himself to the world as a 300-year-old werewolf. He wore a vial of blood around his neck, a visceral token of his detachment from conventional society. His appearance was striking and intentionally abrasive. Messy dark hair, heavy makeup, and a wardrobe that signaled a militant rejection of the status quo. Steinke was a man unmoored, filling the vacuum of his existence with fantasies of violence, immortality, and dark romance. He was a figure of the fringe, someone who should have remained a local curiosity, a footnote in the social landscape of Medicine Hat. The collision of these two trajectories, the 12-year-old schoolgirl and the 23-year-old drifter, occurred in the public spaces where the town's youth congregated. They met at a punk rock show, a venue that provided the perfect backdrop for their shared disaffection. For Jasmine, Steinke was not a predator or a loser. He was an avatar of the freedom she craved. He was the living embodiment of the lyrics she listened to and the aesthetic she idolized. He validated her resentment toward her parents, reflecting it back to her with the intensity of an adult man who had never grown up. For Steinke, Jasmine offered something equally intoxicating: total, uncritical adoration. In her eyes, his delusions of lycanthropy and vampirism were not ridiculous, they were powerful. She was a blank slate upon which he could project his fantasy of being a Dark Lord, a misunderstood anti-hero fighting against a mundane world. The relationship developed with frightening speed, fueled by the digital landscape of the mid-2000s. The internet became their sanctuary and their war room. On the website vampirefreaks.com, they curated their personas. Jasmine adopted the handle Runaway Devil, while Steinke went by Soul Eater. In these chat rooms and instant messaging windows, the age gap of 11 years evaporated, replaced by a shared language of nihilism. The logs of their conversations reveal a hermetically sealed feedback loop. They spoke of love in apocalyptic terms, framing their bond as something that transcended human morality. They fed each other's worst impulses, with Steinke playing the role of the protector and mentor in darkness, and Jasmine playing the role of the oppressed victim of a tyrannical household. The friction between Jasmine and her parents was inevitable. Mark and Deborah Richardson were not oblivious. They saw the older man, the makeup, the influence he held over their daughter, and they reacted with the protective instincts of responsible parents. They recognized the glaring inappropriateness of a 23-year-old man courting a 12-year-old girl. They did what any rational guardians would do. They tried to sever the connection. They grounded Jasmine. They restricted her internet access. They forbade her from seeing Steinke. In the logic of the Richardson household, these were corrective measures designed to save their daughter from a predator. They believed they were fighting a battle of discipline and boundaries. They did not realize they were fighting a battle of mythology. To Jasmine and Steinke, the parents' intervention was not protection. It was an act of war. It validated the narrative they had constructed. The Richardsons became the villains in the twisted fairy tale the couple was writing. Every punishment, every lecture, every locked door was interpreted as proof that the world was trying to destroy their eternal love. Steinke, in his communications with Jasmine, began to posture as the solution to her problem. He framed violence not as a crime, but as a necessity, a way to liberate his princess from her captors. The psychological dynamic was complex. While Steinke was the adult with the physical capacity for violence, the digital evidence suggests that Jasmine was far from a passive participant. She expressed a visceral hatred for her parents, a desire to see them removed from the equation. The discussions shifted from running away to something far more permanent. The collision course was further accelerated by their consumption of media that glorified the use against the world narrative. The film Natural Born Killers became a touchstone for them, a blueprint for how they perceived their relationship. They saw themselves in the characters of Mickey and Mallory Knox, outlaws bound by blood and love, persecuted by a society that couldn't understand them. This delusion insulated them from the moral weight of what they were proposing. Murder was sanitized into a romantic gesture. The abstract idea of killing the parents began to calcify into a concrete plan. By April of 2006, the tension in the Richardson home was palpable. Jasmine was resentful, volatile, and secretive. Mark and Deborah were exhausted, struggling to reach the daughter who had become a stranger to them. They sought help, they consulted others, but they were operating under the assumption that the worst-case scenario was rebellion or running away. They could not conceive of the level of malice that was festering just beneath the surface. Meanwhile, in the digital realm, the planning had become specific. They discussed methods, they discussed timing. Steinke bragged to friends about what he was capable of, statements that were largely dismissed as the posturing of an eccentric goth wannabe. No one around Steinke took him seriously enough to intervene, a fatal error that allowed the fantasy to gain momentum until it became inevitable. The disparity between the two families involved further highlights the tragedy. The Richardsons were deeply embedded in the community, their lives defined by structure and care. They had a young son, Jacob, who was 8 years old, a boy who idolized his sister and lived in the innocent warmth of his parents' protection. In contrast, Steinke's world was fragmented. He lived with his mother, but existed in a nocturnal loop of alcohol, drugs, and role-playing. He had no career prospects, no stability, and no moral compass to check his impulses. When these two worlds rubbed against each other, the hyperstructured moral world of the Richardsons and the chaotic amoral world of Steinke, the friction generated enough heat to burn everything down. The days leading up to the night of April 23rd were marked by a terrifying calm in the digital communications. The decision had seemingly been made. The collision was no longer a possibility. It was a scheduled event. Jasmine's complaints about her parents reached a fever pitch. She described her home as a prison and her parents as wardens. Steinke, fueled by a toxic mix of bravado and a desire to prove his devotion, assured her that he would handle it. The plan was simple and brutal. Eliminate the obstacles. The logic of the 12-year-old mind, incapable of fully grasping the finality of death, merged with the stunted emotional development of the 23-year-old, creating a deadly synergy. On the final evening, the normalcy of the Richardson home was indistinguishable from any other night. Mark and Deborah were home. Jacob was in his bed. The routines of a Sunday night were being observed. Outside the quiet streets of Medicine, Hat offered no warning. There was no storm, no ominous sign, just the silence of a prairie town settling in for the work week. But moving through that silence was Jeremy Steinke, accompanied by a female accomplice who acted as a driver and guided by the instructions of the girl inside the house. The collision course that had begun with a chance meeting at a punk show, that had been nurtured in the dark corners of the internet, and that had been hardened by the parents' desperate attempts to intervene, was about to reach its terminal velocity. The background of this tragedy is not a story of sudden madness, but of a slow, deliberate erosion of boundaries. It is a clinical study in how a shared delusion can override the most basic human instincts. The Richardsons believed they were dealing with a rebellious child. They did not know they were dealing with a co-conspirator. They believed Steinke was a bad influence. They did not know he was a prospective executioner. The intersection of Jasmine Richardson's adolescent rage and Jeremy Steinke's violent narcissism created a closed universe where murder was the only logical exit strategy. As the sun set on April 23, 2006, the families, the relationship, and the delusion were all locked in place. The collision was imminent, and the destruction it would leave in its wake would be absolute, shattering the illusion of safety in Medicine Hat forever. The chronology of the Richardson family murders is a sequence of events marked by a chilling transition from suburban tranquility to calculated slaughter, defined by a specific window of time in the early hours of April 23, 2006. The narrative of that night does not begin with the first blow, but with the silent approach of 23-year-old Jeremy Steinke to the residence in Medicine Hat, Alberta. It was a Sunday night, bleeding into Monday morning, when the quiet residential street was obscured by the darkness of a moonless prairie sky. The timeline, reconstructed through forensic analysis and subsequent admissions, establishes a precise series of movements that dismantled the family in less than an hour. At approximately 12:30 a.m., the perimeter of the Richardson home was breached. This is the moment the investigation would later designate as the point of no return. Steinke, dressed in black and concealing a knife, approached the basement window well. This specific entry point had been pre-selected, a detail that would later prove crucial in establishing premeditation over impulse. The breaking of the glass was not a shatter that woke the neighborhood, but a muffled destruction, enough to grant access to the basement living area. This act of intrusion severed the physical security of the home, introducing a foreign, lethal element into the sleeping household. The timeline inside the house moves with rapid, violent fluidity. Upon entering the basement, the intruder was not immediately met with resistance, but the noise of the entry, the crunch of glass, and the thud of boots on the floor alerted Deborah Richardson. Deborah, 48 years old, was the first to investigate the disturbance. Forensic reconstruction suggests she encountered Steinke near the foot of the stairs or in the hallway of the lower level. The confrontation was immediate. There was no prolonged negotiation or standoff. The violence inflicted upon Deborah was sudden and overwhelming, characterized by multiple stab wounds that indicated a frenzy of motion. The pathology report would later detail 12 separate wounds, but it was the ferocity of the attack that silenced her screams quickly, leaving her incapacitated on the basement floor. The commotion in the basement, however brief, traveled upwards. Mark Richardson, 42, was awakened in the master bedroom on the upper level. The timeline dictates that he descended the stairs moments after the attack on his wife had commenced. He was met by Steinke, who was now moving upward, driven by the momentum of the initial kill. The encounter between Mark and Steinke took place on the stairs and spilled into the main level. Unlike the ambush of Deborah, Mark offered significant defensive resistance. The crime scene analysis of the hallway and staircase revealed a struggle, evidenced by blood spatter patterns consistent with a man fighting for his life while retreating and attempting to shield the upper rooms. Mark sustained extensive trauma, eventually succumbing to his injuries. The brutality of his death was clinically noted as overkill, a term used when the number of injuries far exceeds what is necessary to cause death, indicating a perpetrator in a state of heightened rage or dissociation. With both parents neutralized, the timeline advances to the final and most harrowing phase of the murders, the death of 8-year-old Jacob Richardson. The boy had been in his bedroom on the upper floor. The specific details of this time frame are derived from the later testimony regarding the sequence of rooms entered. Steinke entered the child's room last. The forensic evidence found in Jacob's room, specifically the position of the body and the blood evidence on the bed, suggests the child was awake and aware of the intruder's presence. The interaction was brief. The slash to the throat was delivered with the same clinical lethality as the attacks on the parents, ending the life of the youngest family member and bringing the active violence to a halt. The entire physical assault on the family likely transpired in under 15 minutes. Following the cessation of violence, the timeline enters a period of silence. The house, now a tomb, contained the bodies of Mark, Deborah, and Jacob, while the 12-year-old daughter, Jasmine, and Steinke remained alive within the walls. They did not flee immediately. The investigation would later uncover that a period of time, perhaps an hour or more, was spent inside the residence following the murders. This interval was used to attempt a rudimentary cleanup and to gather personal items, a behavior that speaks to a jarring disconnect from the carnage they had just orchestrated. By the time they departed the scene in the family's vehicle, the sun had not yet risen. The house was left locked, the curtains drawn, the broken basement window the only external sign of the catastrophic event that had occurred within. The sun rose on Medicine Hat on Monday, April 24, 2006, with no external indication that the Richardson home was a crime scene. The neighborhood continued its routine. The discovery of the bodies was not the result of a police patrol or a scheduled check, but occurred through the innocent curiosity of a child. At approximately 1 p.m., a young friend of Jacob Richardson arrived at the house, intending to call on the boy to play. Finding the doorbell unanswered and the house silent, the child went to the rear of the property and peered through a window. The sight that greeted the witness was the body of a motionless adult on the floor. The child, confused and frightened, ran home to alert his own mother. The call to emergency services was logged shortly thereafter. The initial dispatch was for a check on welfare, with the caller reporting a potential medical emergency or a suspicious scene. Constable responding units arrived at the Richardson residence within minutes. The officers approached the house with standard caution, but the visual confirmation through the window escalated the situation immediately to a major crime scene protocol. Upon tactical entry, law enforcement officials were assaulted by the sensory reality of the massacre. The air inside the home was heavy with the metallic scent of oxidized blood. The layout of the bodies confirmed a targeted extermination rather than a robbery gone wrong. Valuables were largely untouched, save for specific items relevant to the daughter. Deborah Richardson was found in the basement, Mark on the main floor, and Jacob in his bed. The clinical assessment by the first paramedics on scene confirmed rigor mortis was well established, placing the time of death many hours prior, consistent with the midnight timeline constructed later. The immediate investigation began the moment the house was secured. Inspector Brent Secondiak and the Major Crimes Unit of the Medicine Hat Police Service assumed command. The scene processing was meticulous, requiring the use of stepping plates to navigate the blood-saturated flooring without contaminating evidence. While forensic identification officers began the grim task of photographing the carnage and swabbing for DNA, the operational detectives focused on a glaring anomaly: the absence of the 12-year-old daughter. At this juncture, the investigation bifurcated into two critical streams: the forensic processing of the triple homicide and the urgent search for a missing child. The immediate working theory was that the daughter was a victim of abduction, potentially taken by the same person who had slaughtered her family. The criteria for an Amber Alert were reviewed, but the situation was fluid. Detectives needed to ascertain if she was taken by force or if she had fled. The broken basement window suggested a forced entry, supporting the abduction theory, Yet certain inconsistencies began to surface within the first hours. Detectives began canvassing the neighborhood and interviewing close relations to build a victimology profile. It was during these initial interviews, on the afternoon of April 24th, that the name Jeremy Steinke first surfaced, though not initially as a prime suspect for murder, but as an associate of the daughter. Friends of the daughter, fellow middle school students, provided police with information regarding her relationship with a much older male, a 23-year-old, who went by the online handle Soul Eater. This information pivoted the investigation. The disparity in age, 12 and 23, immediately flagged Steinke as a person of interest regarding the girl's whereabouts. Simultaneously, the digital forensics team began a rapid exploitation of the family's computer and internet history. In 2006, digital footprints were often less encrypted than in the modern era. Analysts quickly accessed the daughter's profile on the website vampirefreaks.com and her instant messaging logs. The content of these communications was alarming. The messages exchanged between the user accounts identified as the daughter and Steinke revealed a shared fantasy life deeply rooted in goth subculture, discussing themes of death, immortality, and hatred for her parents. The digital dialogue provided a potential motive that shifted the perspective from a random home invasion to a targeted personal attack. By the evening of April 24th, less than 24 hours after the murders, the investigation had moved from a general unknown suspect to a specific focus on Jeremy Steinke. The police were no longer looking for a random drifter. They were looking for a specific blue pickup truck and two individuals. The urgency was palpable. If the daughter was a hostage, every hour diminished her chances of survival. If she was an accomplice, they were dealing with two fugitives capable of extreme violence. The timeline of the investigation accelerated rapidly on April 25th. Surveillance teams were deployed to locations associated with Steinke. Intelligence suggested he might be in the vicinity of Leader, Saskatchewan, a distinct jurisdiction but within driving distance. The coordination between the Medicine Hat Police Service and the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, RCMP, was seamless. The objective was to locate the vehicle and execute a high-risk takedown. The breakthrough came when the suspect vehicle was spotted. The interception occurred approximately 130 kilometers away from the crime scene. The arrest was executed with tactical precision. Inside the vehicle were Jeremy Steinke and the 12-year-old daughter. The physical condition of the pair was noted immediately by arresting officers. They appeared calm, almost detached. There were no signs that the girl was bound or under direct physical duress at the moment of the stop, a visual observation that began to erode the abduction theory in the minds of the investigators. Both suspects were transported back to Medicine Hat for interrogation. This marked the end of the immediate manhunt and the beginning of the complex judicial timeline. The forensic link was solidified quickly. Clothing recovered from the suspects and the vehicle was stained with blood that DNA analysis would later confirm belonged to the Richardson family. However, the psychological timeline, the why, and the specific choreography of the night relied heavily on the interviews that followed. The interrogation of Jeremy Steinke began with him adopting a persona consistent with his online identity. He spoke in riddles, referenced lycanthropy, and claimed to be a centuries-old werewolf. He attempted to shield the girl, claiming full responsibility for the physical acts of murder. However, the timeline he presented had gaps. He described the taste of blood and the thrill of the kill, attempting to frame the event as a supernatural necessity rather than a domestic slaughter. Parallel to Steinke's interrogation, the 12-year-old was being interviewed. Her demeanor oscillated between the affect of a grieving child and a cold, detached observer. It was the discrepancy between her initial statements and the hard evidence that began to destroy Steinke's protective narrative. While Steinke was posturing as a monster to protect her innocence, the digital timeline reconstructed by police, the emails, the chat logs, the timing of the window breaking, painted a picture of mutual conspiracy. The night of broken glass was not merely about the physical shattering of the basement pane. It represented the shattering of the investigatory assumption that a child is inherently incapable of patricide and matricide. The investigation revealed that the entry was not a brute force break-in, but a coordinated allow-in. The glass was broken to stage a scene, to create the illusion of an external threat. As the weeks turned into the pre-trial phase, the weight of the evidence began to press down on the initial narratives. The timeline of the murders was corroborated by the blood flow patterns and the autopsy results. Deborah died first, explaining the lack of alert to the upper floors initially. Mark died fighting, explaining the widespread blood in the hallway. Jacob died last, in his bed, confirming the systematic clearing of the house. The investigation also focused on the timeline of the days leading up to April 23rd. It was established that the plan had been discussed, refined, and agreed upon. The purchase of the materials, the discussion of the method, and the selection of the date were all plotted on the calendar of the investigation. The police were able to map Steinke's movements through cell tower triangulation, placing him at the residence at the exact time the window was breached. The final element of the immediate investigation was the recovery of the murder weapon and the clothes worn during the act. Based on information gleaned during the initial detention, search teams scourged the route between Medicine Hat and the arrest site. The recovery of these items provided the biological link that tied Steinke irrevocably to the interior of the house. The blood on his clothing was not a transfer from a hug or a casual contact. It was high-velocity spatter, placing him within inches of the strikes that killed Mark and Deborah Richardson. This chapter of the event, from the stealthy approach to the window well to the arrest on the highway, established the factual bedrock upon which the prosecution would build its case. The clinical reality of the timeline stripped away the goth fantasy Steinke tried to project. There were no werewolves or vampires in the Richardson home that night. There was only a man with a knife and a plan, executing a timeline of destruction that left 3 people dead and a community permanently scarred by the proximity of such darkness. The immediate investigation concluded not with a mystery, but with a horror. The realization that the call was coming from inside the relationship, and the broken glass was merely the opening curtain of a tragedy scripted by 2 minds acting as one. The courtroom in Medicine Hat, Alberta, was sealed in a heavy, suffocating silence as the trial of Jeremy Steinke entered its most critical phase. The air inside the Court of Queen's Bench was thick with the residue of weeks of gruesome evidence. Crime scene photographs of the Richardson family home, the blood-stained carpet, and the lifeless bodies of Mark, Deborah, and 8-year-old Jacob Richardson. Steinke, 25 years old at the time of the trial, but 23 when he held the knife, sat at the defense table. He had traded his trench coat and vial of blood for a crisp suit, his hair cut short, an attempt to mask the soul-eater persona he had cultivated online. But the physical transformation could not erase the digital footprint that was about to dismantle his defense. The defense strategy had been calculated and consistent. They sought to portray Steinke not as a cold-blooded thrill killer, but as a misguided, intoxicated romantic, a modern-day Romeo caught in a drug-fueled haze, manipulated by a 12-year-old Juliet. His legal team, led by defense attorney Alan Berry, argued for a conviction of manslaughter rather than first-degree murder. They painted a picture of a young man who had consumed a formidable cocktail of cocaine and alcohol on the night of April 23, 2006. According to their narrative, Steinke had gone to the Richardson home merely to talk to Jasmine's parents, to plead the case for their forbidden love. They claimed things had gone wrong only when Mark Richardson attacked him, triggering a defensive, albeit excessive, reaction in a mind clouded by intoxication. If the jury believed this narrative, that Steinke was a puppet acting in a reactive, dissociative state, he might escape the life sentence that accompanied first-degree murder. The defense needed the jury to see him as human, flawed, and fundamentally broken, rather than evil. Steinke himself took the witness stand to sell this version of events. He spoke with a soft, almost polite demeanor, a stark contrast to the monster the prosecution described. He detailed his consumption of a Mickey of hard liquor and lines of cocaine. He described the chaotic blur of the night, claiming his memories were fragmented, like shards of glass he couldn't quite piece together. He admitted to killing the parents, but claimed it was never the plan. However, the prosecution, led by Crown Prosecutor Ramona Robbins, was ready to introduce the counter-narrative. This narrative did not rely on the shifting, convenient memories of the accused. Instead, it relied on the cold, hard, unchangeable testimony of the co-conspirator. While Jasmine Richardson, the 12-year-old daughter of the victims, did not sit physically in the witness box at Steinke's trial, having already been convicted in her own proceedings. Her voice was the most powerful weapon in the courtroom. Her testimony came in the form of the digital transcripts, the letters, and the relentless logs of MSN Messenger conversations that the two had exchanged in the weeks leading up to the massacre. This was the pivotal moment where the defense's narrative began to crumble under the weight of factual grounding. The Crown presented the conversations between the screen names Soul Eater, Steinke, and Runaway Devil, Jasmine. These were not the erratic ravings of a drunkard or the passive listening of a manipulated boy. They were the calculated, enthusiastic plottings of a partner in crime. The courtroom listened as the transcripts were read into the record. The clinical precision of the timestamps paired with the visceral horror of the content created a dissonance that was physically uncomfortable for those in the gallery. In these logs, Steinke was not a reluctant participant. He was a driving force. The jury heard his digital voice bragging about the necessity of the violence. "It starts with me killing them," Steinke had typed. The clarity of that sentence cut through the defense's fog of intoxication. There was no ambiguity in the text, no slur in the typing. As Steinke sat on the stand during cross-examination, he was forced to confront Jasmine's words and his own responses. The prosecutor systematically deconstructed his claims of an accidental escalation. She pointed to Jasmine's messages where she expressed impatience, asking when it would be done, and Steinke's assurances that the plan was solid. The defensive eye just went to talk, evaporated when confronted with the text message Steinke sent to a friend just prior to the murders, stating that it was going down that night. The most damning aspect of Jasmine's testimony, the evidence of her intent which Steinke validated, was the discussion regarding 8-year-old Jacob. Steinke had tried to claim on the stand that he had no issue with the little boy, that the child's death was a tragedy he couldn't explain. but the chat logs revealed a discussion about leaving no witnesses. Jasmine had expressed concern that her brother would wake up. Steinke had assured her that wouldn't be a problem. The callousness of discussing the murder of a child in the same casual tone as planning a date destroyed any sympathy the jury might have harbored for the intoxicated Romeo. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted perceptibly. The image of the confused young man in the suit dissolved, replaced by the image of the man who had described the taste of blood to his friends. The prosecution highlighted that Jasmine's account of the night, preserved in her own trial's agreed statement of facts and the interrogation videos, aligned perfectly with the forensic evidence, whereas Steinke's testimony on the stand contradicted the physical reality of the crime scene. Steinke claimed Mark Richardson attacked him in the dark with a screwdriver, but the forensic evidence, supported by Jasmine's account of the plan, showed that Mark was attacked with a knife Steinke had brought with him, a large Bowie knife concealed in his coat. The screwdriver was a fabrication, a desperate attempt to claim self-defense. Jasmine's statements indicated they entered the house quietly, through a basement window she had left unlocked, specifically to catch the parents sleeping. This was an ambush, not a confrontation gone wrong. Furthermore, the defense's reliance on Steinke's claim of a blackout during the murder of Deborah Richardson was obliterated by the testimony regarding the 911 call. On the night of the murder, Deborah had managed to dial 911. The jury heard the recording, the terrified screams of a woman watching her husband die, followed by her own silence. The timeline established by the call, combined with the chat logs, proved Steinke had the presence of mind to silence her. Jasmine's account detailed how she and Steinke had moved through the house. She hadn't been a passive observer. She had been a guide, and Steinke had followed that guide willingly. The cross-examination reached its zenith when the prosecutor confronted Steinke with his own high school confidential behavior. He had bragged to an undercover officer, who had been placed in a cell with him shortly after his arrest, about the thrill of the kill. In that sting operation, Steinke hadn't sounded regretful or confused. He had sounded proud. He told the officer, posing as a seasoned criminal, that you don't feel nothing, and described the guttural sounds of the dying parents. When the prosecution juxtaposed this recording with his soft-spoken courtroom demeanor, the duality was undeniable. Jasmine's role in this was to validate the premeditation. She had demanded a demonstration of his love through blood, and he had been eager to provide it. The crushing blow came when the subject of the little boy, Jacob, returned to the forefront. The autopsy revealed the boy had been discouraged from screaming, his throat slashed. Steinke tried to distance himself from this specific act, hinting that perhaps Jasmine had done it, or that he simply didn't remember. But the Crown used the chat logs to show the pact. We need to get rid of them all. Steinke's acceptance of that condition in the digital record made him culpable for every death in that house, regardless of whose hand held the knife at the final moment. The law of parties in Canada meant that by agreeing to the plan and facilitating the entry, he was responsible for the entire massacre. As the trial drew to a close, the narrative of the tragic lovers was thoroughly dissected. Jasmine's testimony, her digital ghost, had turned on him. She had not painted him as a hero who saved her from abuse, as he had hoped. Her communications revealed a mutual obsession with death and notoriety. She had used him as a weapon, yes, but he had been a loaded gun waiting for a trigger. The defense's attempt to use her age to infantilize Steinke backfired. The logs showed he treated her as an equal partner in the conspiracy, validating her dark fantasies and escalating them into reality. The vivid description of the crime scene provided by the first responders served as the final seal on the case. The Crown walked the jury through the house again. The basement, where the window was breached, the stairs Steinke crept up, the master bedroom where the violence exploded. They described the sheer volume of blood, a detail that Steinke had once fetishized in his online persona, but now tried to shy away from. The clinical reality of the wounds, the defensive cuts on Mark's hands, the fatal injury to Deborah, spoke of a frenzied but directed attack. In the end, it was the synthesis of the digital evidence and the forensic reality that destroyed Jeremy Steinke. He could not outrun the words he had typed. He could not unsay the promises of murder he had made to a 12-year-old girl in the quiet glow of a computer screen. The jury saw past the suit and the soft voice. They saw the soul eater. The deliberation was relatively short given the complexity of the case. The jury returned with their verdict, guilty on 3 counts of first-degree murder. The strategy to plead down to manslaughter had failed completely. The factual grounding of the case, the undeniable premeditation recorded in the chat logs, had been insurmountable. Steinke stood emotionless as the verdict was read. The testimony about that night, pieced together from the digital ruins of his relationship with Jasmine, had not only convicted him, but had stripped away the romantic myth he tried to build around the slaughter. He was not a tragic hero. He was a triple murderer. The judge sentenced him to life in prison, with no possibility of parole for 25 years, the mandatory sentence for first-degree murder in Canada. The Romeo and Juliet defense died on the floor of the Medicine Hat courthouse, slain by the cold, hard text of their own design. The air inside the Greene County Justice Center in Springfield, Missouri, had grown heavy with the accumulated weight of a tragedy that defied simple categorization. It was February 2019, nearly 4 years after the body of Claudine D. Blanchard was found face down on her bed, her back riddled with stab wounds, in the bright pink bungalow that had once been a symbol of community charity. For Nicholas Godijon, the young man from Wisconsin, who had traveled hundreds of miles to carry out the deed, the proceedings were reaching their terminal point. The courtroom, devoid of the theatrics often seen in television dramas, was instead filled with the clinical, grinding proceduralism of the justice system, a machine designed to process horror into paperwork and penitence. Godijon sat at the defense table, his posture often slumped, wearing an orange jumpsuit that clashed violently with the somber suits of the legal counsel surrounding him. He was no longer just the internet boyfriend who had conspired in secret chat rooms. He was a convicted murderer, facing the ultimate erasure of his freedom. The jury had already deliberated in November 2018, rejecting the defense's argument for diminished capacity and finding him guilty of murder in the first degree. Now, it was up to Judge David Jones to formalize the sentence, a ritual that would seal Godijon inside the Missouri Department of Corrections for the remainder of his natural life. The disparity in outcomes between the two conspirators was the elephant in the room, a source of profound discomfort for observers and legal analysts alike. Gypsy Rose Blanchard, the architect of the escape plan and the beneficiary of the murder, was already serving a 10-year sentence after accepting a plea deal for second-degree murder. Her testimony had been the linchpin of the prosecution's case against Godijon. She had taken the stand, looking frail and small, and narrated the events of June 2015 with a clarity that cut through Godijon's defense. She described handing him the gloves and the knife. She described hiding in the bathroom with her hands over her ears while her mother screamed. Her words painted Godejohn not merely as a manipulated pawn, but as a willing executioner who had the agency to say no, yet chose violence. That testimony had effectively dismantled the narrative that Godejohn was too cognitively impaired to understand the gravity of his actions. During the sentencing phase and the preceding trial, the psychological analysis of Nicholas Godejohn became the focal point of a fierce debate regarding culpability and mental health. Defense psychologist Dr. Kent Franks had testified that Godejohn suffered from autism spectrum disorder and possessed an IQ of 82, placing him in the low average range of intelligence. Dr. Franks argued that this cognitive profile made Godejohn uniquely susceptible to manipulation, describing him as having the emotional maturity of a child. The defense painted a portrait of a lonely, socially isolated young man who lived in a fantasy world, one where he believed he was a 500-year-old vampire named Vector, protecting his fairy princess. In this delusion, killing DD was not a crime but a rescue mission, a necessary evil to save the woman he loved from a monster. However, the prosecution, led by Greene County prosecutor Dan Patterson, countered this narrative with cold, hard evidence of premeditation. They presented the text messages exchanged between the couple, thousands of lines of digital dialogue that revealed a planning process spanning weeks. Godejohn had discussed logistics, weapons, and alibis. He had asked Gypsy to keep the knife in a safe place. This was not the chaotic impulse of a confused mind, the state argued, but the calculated decision of a man who knew that taking a life was wrong, but did it anyway to secure a sexual and romantic future with Gypsy. The psychological evaluation provided by the state emphasized that, while Godejohn might be on the spectrum, he retained the capacity to distinguish right from wrong. The brutality of the act, 17 stab wounds inflicted while the victim was asleep and vulnerable, required a level of physical and mental commitment that the law deems unforgivable. When Judge David Jones handed down the sentence, there was no hesitation. He denied the defense's motion for a new trial and sentenced Nicholas Godejohn to life in prison without the possibility of parole, adding a consecutive 25 years for armed criminal action. The judge noted the blind devotion Godejohn had for Gypsy, but affirmed that it did not excuse the cold-blooded nature of the execution. Godejohn, upon hearing his fate, asked if he could ever get a chance to be free, a question that betrayed a lingering lack of comprehension regarding the finality of the legal system. His request was denied. He was led away, destined for the Potosi Correctional Center, a maximum security facility that would become his entire world. Outside the courtroom, the community of Springfield remained in a state of shattered disbelief. The psychological fallout extended far beyond the perpetrators. This was a neighborhood that had embraced Dee Dee and Gypsy Rose Blanchard. They had been the darlings of the local Habitat for Humanity chapter, the recipients of free trips to Disney World, backstage passes to concerts, and endless charitable donations. Neighbors who had mowed their lawn and brought them casseroles now had to reconcile their memories of a saintly mother and a sick child with the reality of a fraudster and a matricidal conspirator. The revelation of Munchausen syndrome by proxy, or factitious disorder imposed on another, turned their acts of kindness into fuel for Dee Dee's abuse. They felt complicit, duped, and violated. The bright pink house with the wheelchair ramp became a macabre tourist attraction, a physical scar on the landscape that reminded everyone of the lies they had swallowed whole. The legacy of the case reshaped the public understanding of domestic abuse and medical child abuse. It forced a national conversation about how easily medical professionals and social workers could be deceived by a charismatic manipulator. Dee Dee Blanchard had fooled doctors across multiple states, subjecting her healthy daughter to unnecessary surgeries, feeding tubes, and medications that rotted her teeth and induced symptoms of leukemia and muscular dystrophy. In the court of public opinion, sympathy swung wildly. Gypsy was viewed by many as a victim who snapped, a hostage who eliminated her captor because she saw no other way out. This public sentiment undoubtedly played a role in the plea deal she received. For Nicholas Godejohn, however, there was no such tidal wave of public support. He became the repository for the case's darkest elements. He was the one who held the knife. He was the one who straddled the sleeping woman and ended her life. While Gypsy began her rehabilitation in the Chillicothe Correctional Center, eventually preparing for a release that would see her reintegrate into society, Godejohn remained in the abyss. His legacy is that of the discarded weapon, the instrument used to break a chain, which was then locked away forever. In the years following the sentencing, the pink house was eventually repainted, its identifying features stripped away in an attempt to sanitize the neighborhood of its ghostly history. But the psychological stain remained. The case of the boy who murdered his girlfriend's parents is cited in legal and psychological textbooks as a quintessential example of folie à deux, a shared madness where two distorted realities converge to produce a catastrophe. For the community of Springfield, for the families involved, and for Nicholas Godejohn sitting in his cell the night of June 14, 2015, never truly ended. It simply evolved into a lifetime of questions with no satisfying answers, a narrative of manipulation and murder where the line between victim and villain was drawn in blood, and then blurred by the tears of a girl who testified against the only person who tried to save her. The silence that now engulfs the site of the Richardson family home in Medicine Hat serves as a grim monument to a delusion that turned deadly. In the span of a single horrific night, Jeremy Steinke extinguished 2 generations, ending the lives of Mark and Deborah, and brutally cutting short the future of 8-year-old Jacob. What Steinke viewed as a darkly romantic mission was, in cold reality, an irreversible descent into savagery. His path was sealed the moment he stepped through that door, trading his freedom for a lifetime behind the walls of the Edmonton institution. Yet, the final blow to his distorted fantasy came not from the gavel, but from the witness stand. Jasmine Richardson, the very object of his obsession, dismantled the mythology they had built together. Her testimony stripped away the theatrical veil of their relationship, exposing the raw, ugly mechanics of the massacre. By speaking the stark truth of that night, she shattered the persona Steinke clung to, leaving him to face his life sentence as nothing more than a man who destroyed a family. The tragedy remains absolute, a permanent scar on the community defined by the loss of innocence and the enduring heavy weight of the truth.